welcome to the 5th episode of my Pygame tutorial series. After the last video, I got a bunch of messages on Discord asking about animation. I was originally planning to do this episode on Infinite Worlds, but I decided that since people were asking for it, and it kind of makes more sense this way, I was going to do this video on animation, and then also I'm going to make the video after this, music and sound effects, and then probably after that I'll do Infinite Worlds. The stuff I previously made a tutorial was this platformer. It's got a scrolling camera, you can jump around and it collides correctly with tiles. There's a little bit of a parallax effect in the background. There's also a map file where you can modify the map. But for this episode, I made a couple changes. I got rid of the player image and I turned it into two sets of animations. First is the idle animation, which is these three images. You're just kind of like bobbing up and down. And then the run animation, which is super simple, it's just 2 frames. Whenever I'm implementing something new, usually I try to break down what it is to figure out how to code it. So if you think about what animation is, it's really just a sequence of images, and in like the case of a running animation, it's just looping over and over again. And normally when you first start programming games, you'll just have one image for something. It's really not too hard to make it switch between 2 images. What I'm going to be doing for this video is a little bit more of a complex system. I'll have stuff for loading the animations. I'll have stuff for setting the animation for the player to different actions. One will be idle and one will be run. And then I'll have an animation database for storing all the frames. And I'll also have the animation database for storing all of like the timing. Normally you have one image showing for like, I don't know, 10 frames, and then you switch to the other one, in this case, and then it goes back and forth. And then of course I have to code the stuff for actually cycling through the images. So the first thing I'm going to need to start with is the animation loading system. So right now, with the old code, it would crash now because I moved the player image into its own animation folder. It's currently loading the player image right here, and I'm going to want to write a function to load the animations instead of just the base image. So when loading animations, you're going to need the path of the animation, and then ideally you'd also have another argument for this function to specify how long you want each frame of the animation to last in terms of frames of the game. So I'm going to set the second argument to frame durations, so how long each image in the animation should last. But I'm also going to set up the animation image database. I'm going to use global variables for this because otherwise it's a little bit more of a pain. If you're typing the whole path, typically you can, if you've got a layout like this where under the animations for a certain thing, so for these are the player animations, and each of these animations has a name, I can chop off this part here, and then I'm left with the name of the animation. So what I'm going to do here is set the animation name to the path the function was given and split it along the forward slashes. And then I'm going, since that returns a list, since it would look something like that, I can actually take the last value, which in this case, if I entered in this path, the last value would be idle in this list since it's splitting along that. So I can take the last value of this list that this returns. I can take that last value by putting a -1 in there. So now this animation name variable contains the name of the animation I'm loading based on this. Next, I'm going to create a variable for the frame data. So what this is breaking down the animation into what images the animation should be showing for each frame of the game, as in there's 60 frames per second or so, and each image within the animation is shown for a certain amount of in-game frames. If something were supposed to be shown for 10 frames, I would want the name of that image in here 10 times. so that every single frame I can go to the next image in this list, and you basically get an animation. So I'm going to set n to 0. I'm going to loop through the frame durations and then add 1 to n every iteration. So I'm going to generate an ID for this specific frame of the animation, and that'll be the animation name plus an underscore plus the string of n. For every frame, well, here, let me write an example. So this would just go in here for the actual function call. And then I'm iterating through that, and then each 7 is how long I want these frames to, well, these images to last in the animation. So each of these images should last about 7 frames in the game's time. You iterate through here, so this frame will contain the 7 value for each iteration. I'm setting this to the animation's name plus an underscore plus the string of n. So the first time through, for this 7, the frame will be 7, and the animation frame ID will be, if I'm putting in the run animation, it would be run underscore and 0 the first time and 1 the second time. So that's the name of these 2 images. And then I can now get the image location by taking the path, adding a /, and then adding this frame ID, and then adding a .png. So that generates the whole path to these images, depending on which one of these it's on. So that way it can find all of the images based on the naming format of this, because you could just do something like 0 and 1. So you can just take out the whole name generation thing, although I don't like to do that. It just doesn't look as good. So I like to use the name of the animation and then a number after an underscore. So yeah, the image location will look something like this for the idle animation. Yeah, that's what the image location contains. For the idle animation on the first iteration, it looks something like that, which is just a path. And then I can do animation image equals, then set the background to transparent, since white is the background color. So in here, like I said, I'm storing all the animation images, and then I can use the names of the images to get the images I need from here. The names will be stored in here. So animation frames, animation ID, well, frame ID. So that's going to be the name of that image. So I'm copying this image into here under the name of that image. And then for I in range frame, this will basically go, so the frame contains like the number 7 in the case of run. So 7 times it'll do whatever I write here for the run animation. And then I'll add the frame ID to the animation frame data for however many times that frame's supposed to be in there. So this will probably make a little bit more sense when you see what data this is making. Last thing I want to do is to return that frame data. And then I'm going to basically attempt to load one of these 8 animations. Now let's see what this generates. It's going to crash because it's still using some of the old code. But this is what the animations data is. So every frame, it goes to the next one in here, the next value in here, and uses that image. So I'll start on idle 0, idle 0, idle 0 for 7 frames, and then I'll go to idle 1 for 7 frames, and idle 2. But these aren't the actual images, that's just the name of what image it should be using. So you actually get the image you need from the animation frames variable from earlier. Idle 0 is this, idle 1 is this, and idle 2 is this. Now that we've got the animation loading function working, I need somewhere to store these animations because it just outputs that list with all of the images for the animation. I'm going to store it in an animation database variable. And for each one of the two animations, I'm going to load them and store them into this animation database variable. So I'll start with run. I'll set each frame, each image in the animation to 7 frames long. So what this is doing is storing the list of images under the key run. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the idle animation. There we go. So now we've got our 2 animations in here. You can see here, there's 2 values in here, so there's 2 images for run, and 3 values in here, so there's 3 images for idle. And then if I run it, I should be able to check the animation database variable and see the animations. So I can do something like animation database run, and it'll give me the run animation. Now we need to try to implement it, but normally I like to use something I call an action system, so that you can basically specify what animation you want something using. It's as simple as just setting a variable that stores what action something is currently doing. And it's also important to have a variable to keep track of what frame it's on in its animations. So when adding animations, I like to add 2 variables for whatever I'm adding animations for. Normally I do this within a class. For this, I'm just going to set the player action to idle as a default, and then player frame to 0. I'll set a player flip to false, because if you notice, hold on, let me pull up the old project. If you notice in here, when I go left, the character is still facing right. So that's something else I want to add. Pygame has a function for flipping images, which is what I use for that, and I need a variable to keep track of what direction it's facing. So now we've got our action variable to keep track of what action the player is doing. I would like to create a function for changing the action. One of the parameters is going to be the old action, one's going to be what frame it's on, and then the last parameter is going to be the new value for the action. The reason why I create a function for doing this is to just make things easier for changing the animations in general. Just write one line instead of having to do all these checks and stuff, because you don't want to reset the frame the animation is on every single time you set it, always. Basically, you can make it so that if the player's velocity is not 0, you can set the animation to run, and if it's 0, you set it to not run. The issue with that is that you're setting the action you're setting the animation every single frame. If you reset it every single frame, then you'll always be on frame 0, so there's no animation. So you want to check if you're actually changing it to a new value, and if that's the case, then you set the frame to 0. The code I just wrote here checks if the old is different from the new one. If it's different, it'll change it to the new one, and it'll set the frame to 0. Now I just return these 2 values, and that's the changing action function. The important part is just this. It's a conditional thing. You only want to change it sometimes, which is why this whole function's here. The next part is to just actually implement the animation. So I'm going to delete the old player image loading stuff, and then go down to the player stuff down here. So this code still uses the player image, so I'm just going to set the current image of the animation to the player image. So the first thing you want to do is with animations is you want to increase the frame of the animation every single frame and go to the next part of the animation. It may not actually be a new image in the animation. because if you remember on this one, it'll show the same image like 7 times, and then it'll go to a new one or something like that. But that's just to keep track of what one it should be on. This checks if the frame is past the amount of frames there are in an animation, whichever animation it's handling at that time. And then if it's past that limit, it goes to 0. What this does is it basically creates a loop. So once it reaches the end of the animation, it goes back to the beginning. So you may not want this in all animations. Sometimes you might want it to just freeze on the last frame, but most of the time you'll want a loop. So that's what I wrote here. So I'm going to get the image ID next. So what this does is it goes to the animation database. It finds that, it checks for the frames under the current action, and then it gets the specific image ID for whatever frame it's on. So if you remember, I can go into the animation database, and then I can look up the action, and then here are all the frames in that action. So now I can just go to like frame 0, and then I get the ID idle 0, which is right here. So now that I've got the ID for whatever image it should be showing, I'm going to set the player image, which is what this line right here, which renders the player, is using. I'm going to set the player image to animation frames player image ID. If you remember correctly, animation frames contains each image that can be in the animations and then the actual image object. So when I put in the image ID, it'll give me the actual image object, and then now this is the Pygame image, and then I can render that image as the player. Now we're going to want to write the code to control the animations. In this one, this is just idle and run. You can tell what animation it should be showing just by the horizontal velocity. So if the player movement, well, the first value in that list, that's the horizontal velocity. This is just both velocities. If this is more than 0, then you're moving right. So you'd want to set the action to running. So this code sets the action. Thing is, if it's already on run, it will not reset this value to 0. Otherwise, if it was like on idle or something, it'll switch it to 0, so it goes to the beginning of the animation. I'll also want to set the player flip to false, so that it's facing forward. And then I can copy this and do the same thing, except set flip to true. So if it's moving to the left, and then also if player movement is 0, then it's idle. So I'm going to just set this to idle. And you don't want to mess with the flip here because you want to keep whatever direction it was facing before. Because if you stop, you don't want it to turn around and face the other direction or something. Oh, oops, that's an accident. So the flip only changes when the velocity is not 0, and it changes according to whichever direction it is. And it'll change the animation depending on what type of movement it is. You'll be using animations for lots of other stuff if you do this for yourself in larger projects. One common one is jumping. You really just have to look at what code you have and what kind of information you can use to figure out what animation should be shown. In my case, normally I have this collisions variable which keeps track of what types of collisions there were recently. And I can use that to keep track of jumps and also just when the player uses the jump key and stuff. There's all sorts of stuff you can look at, and you just try to set the animation using whatever data you can to figure out what it should be. That's how I do it, at least. And it's just kind of a puzzle for every type of animation. So the last part would be to actually implement the flip. So the function for flipping images is pygame.transform.flip. this flips images. And then the first value is the image you're flipping. Then it's whether it should flip over the x-axis. So I'll set this to the player flip. Well, actually flip over the y-axis technically, but it'll be flipping along the x-axis. And then I don't want to flip it upside down. That last value is for over the x-axis and along the y-axis. So that's like up and down flipping. So I don't want to do any of that. I want it to only be right and left. So this variable will change, and it'll be false if it's facing right, and then true if it's facing left, which will make the player face where it should. So in theory, everything should be working now. You can see, just standing here, the idle animation is playing. You can see the head bobbing up and down. And then I can run. Well, it seems more like a walk, but whatever. The legs are going up and down, and the head's bobbing a little bit. Of course, I don't have a jump animation, so it just runs in the air. Yeah, you can add your own animations and stuff. It's really not hard to add more. You just create another folder or whatever and load that with the function from earlier and set how long each image should last for. And then you set the action to that animation and then it'll play it. But yeah, I use a more advanced animation system in my own projects. I have a whole framework for it. If you guys are interested in learning about how that works, you could just let me know in the comments or something, and I may consider doing a video on it. In my other system, everything's a lot simpler. It automatically loads all the animations and I don't have to specify their names. I have just a text file where I write the duration of each frame in the animations. And then I have a built-in action system for every single entity in the game. All of like the enemies and the players and stuff fall under this entity class, which have all their like physics and animation functions. Yeah, I might do a video on that in the future if people are interested. In the next episode, I should be doing sound effects and music, and then after that, for the 7th episode, I'll probably do Infinite Worlds, which was originally supposed to be this episode. If you have any questions, you can go to my Discord. That's where I'll answer them the quickest. There should be a link to that in the description, or it should be shown on screen. If you're interested in my projects, you can go to my Twitter account and see what I'm working on. And if you want the code for this project and just all the files for it in general, I'll also have that in the description.